The storm had rolled in faster than expected. Dark clouds churned above the thick forest, swallowing the last remnants of daylight. Rain lashed against the towering trees, filling the air with the scent of damp earth and pine. John adjusted the weight of his axe over his shoulder and exhaled, watching the mist of his breath vanish in the cold evening air. He was late, much later than usual. The villagers always warned him never to stay in the forest after sundown, especially near the old path, but he had never been one to entertain ghost stories. He was a man of logic, hardened by years of labour. The forest was nothing more than trees and silence. Yet, as he stood at the crossroads, staring at the two paths that led home, an unfamiliar unease settled in his chest. The long road was safe but treacherous in the storm, winding around cliffs that could turn deadly in the rain. The shorter path was infamous, whispered about in hushed voices around crackling fires. Travellers spoke of strange shadows, unnatural whispers, and figures lurking just out of sight. But John scoffed at such fears. He was a man of the axe, not of folklore. Without another thought, he took the forbidden path. The deeper he ventured, the heavier the silence became. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, were absent. Instead, there was an oppressive quiet, as if the trees themselves held their breath. The rain trickled through the dense canopy in slow, deliberate drips, tapping against the leaves like unseen fingers. It was as if something watched him from the darkness, unseen but impossibly present. Then the sound came. A faint cry, soft, trembling, and unmistakably alive. John froze, his pulse quickening. He turned his head, scanning the dimly lit path, until he saw it. A tiny white goat, barely more than a newborn, lying in the mud. It shivered violently, its thin legs tucked beneath its frail body, its wide, glistening eyes locked onto his, pleading. It let out another pitiful bleat. John hesitated. What was a baby goat doing here, in the middle of the forest, in the middle of the storm? There were no herders nearby, no farms close enough for it to have wandered this far. But the thought of leaving the helpless creature alone gnawed at his conscience. With a sigh, he knelt, brushing wet hair from his face as he reached out. The moment his hands touched the soft fur, a strange sensation prickled through his fingertips. Something almost electric, almost alive. A shiver ran down his spine, but he ignored it. He lifted the goat onto his shoulder, surprised by how light it felt. It barely weighed anything at all. The warmth of its small body was oddly soothing against his neck. He adjusted his grip and started walking again. For the first few minutes, nothing seemed unusual. He was almost amused at himself for feeling uneasy earlier. But then, step by step, the weight on his shoulder began to change. At first, it was subtle, a slight shift, a bit heavier than before. He adjusted the goat, thinking nothing of it. But with each passing minute, the weight grew. His breaths turned shallow. His muscles strained as if he were carrying a sack of stones rather than a tiny animal. He frowned, stopping for a moment to readjust his grip. That's when he saw them. The goat's legs. They were longer, far longer than they should have been. They stretched unnaturally, nearly dragging against the wet ground, bent at odd angles. A jolt of nausea twisted in his gut. His hands trembled as he held the creature away from him, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The tiny goat he had picked up was no longer small. Its body remained light, but its limbs, they had grown impossibly long, like twisted roots creeping towards the earth. And then it spoke, a voice, low, layered, 100 whispers tangled together. It slithered into his ears like a cold wind. "You should not have picked me up, John." The words sent ice through his veins. His knees almost buckled. The weight on his shoulders was unbearable now, crushing, suffocating. He didn't think, he acted. With a choked cry, he hurled the thing off his body. It hit the ground with a sickening crunch, limbs sprawling in unnatural directions. For a moment, there was silence. Then the thing began to rise. John stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The creature no longer resembled a goat. It was tall now, grotesquely elongated, its limbs twisting as if struggling to fit within the confines of reality. Its face was wrong, its eyes black, hollow voids, its mouth stretched into an inhuman grin that split its face. The air around it crackled with an unseen force. John turned and ran. The forest closed in around him, branches clawing at his skin like skeletal fingers. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, darting between the trees. The whispers returned, louder now, circling him like a storm. "Stay, stay, stay with me." He didn't dare look back. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he pushed forward, feet pounding against the slick ground. He could feel it behind him, moving faster than it should be able to, its elongated limbs making no sound as they carried it through the dark. The village lights appeared through the trees, a beacon of salvation. He was almost there. Then the voice came again. "John." It was different now, softer, almost pleading. "Why are you running?" "I only wanted to go home with you." His blood ran cold. Something in him almost stopped, almost turned around. But something deeper, something primal, screamed at him to keep going. He burst through the tree line, collapsing onto the muddy village road. His vision blurred. The last thing he heard before unconsciousness took him was a final, distant whisper. "You didn't look back, but next time, you will." John awoke a week later. His body was weak, his mind a fog of broken memories. The village elders surrounded him, their faces lined with worry and something else, fear. When he finally found the strength to speak, he told them everything. The storm, the shortcut, the thing in the forest. The room fell silent. Then one of the elders spoke, his voice a grave whisper. "You were lucky, John. Had you looked back, it would have taken you." John said nothing. He only stared out the window toward the forest. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches whispering secrets to the dark. And in the distance, past the edge of the village, something watched, waiting. The whispers never left, even as John tried to rebuild his life, returning to his daily routine of chopping wood and tending to his modest home. The feeling of being watched never faded. The villagers avoided him, casting wary glances in his direction when they thought he wasn't looking. The elders who once welcomed him into their council now spoke in hushed voices whenever he passed. Something had changed, not just within John, but in the village itself. The nights were darker, the air felt heavier, and the forest, once a place of solitude, had become a thing of silent menace. It started small, a knock at his door in the dead of night. Too light to be a villager, too deliberate to be the wind. Scratches at his window, always just out of sight, shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. At first he dismissed them as tricks of the mind, remnants of that horrifying night, refusing to let go. But then the voices returned. John ... They whispered through the walls, coiling around his thoughts like vines, thick and suffocating. "Come back, it's waiting." He bolted upright in bed, heart hammering, breath ragged. The candle at his bedside flickered violently, though there was no wind. He stared at the far corner of the room, where the darkness seemed too deep, too solid, like something was standing there. But he would not look. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe. The Elder's warning echoed in his mind. Had you looked back, it would have taken you. He squeezed his eyes shut and lay still, forcing himself to ignore the soft, crawling shuffling coming from the darkness. When morning came, he was still awake. Days passed. The tension in the village grew. Then, one night, someone went missing. It was a young boy named Elias, the blacksmith's son. His mother swore she had tucked him into bed, but by morning his room was empty. No tracks, no signs of struggle, just gone. The village erupted in panic. The men gathered, torches in hand, and searched the outskirts, calling Elias's name into the trees. But no answer came. John stood among them, his blood running cold. He knew, deep down, he knew where the boy had gone. The shortcut. The whispers had taken him. That night, John sat by his fire, staring into the flames. He could still hear them, the soft voices curling around the edges of his mind. You didn't look back, but someone else did. A chill ran down his spine. Outside, the wind howled. Or perhaps it was laughter. A week later, the village midwife vanished. Her door was left ajar. A single footprint, far too large to be human, was found outside her home. The forest was silent, as if holding its breath. John felt it pressing in. The thing that followed him, it was here. The elders called for a meeting, their faces grave. "We must leave," one of them whispered. "This place is cursed." But others shook their heads. Where would we go? This is our home. The debate raged, but in the end, fear was not enough to uproot them. The village stayed, and the whispers grew louder. John no longer slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, the shifting limbs, the gaping void where its face should be, the twisted, grotesque thing that had once masqueraded as a helpless creature in the woods. But now the dream had changed. Now he was no longer running. He was standing still, and something was breathing against his neck. In the dream, he knew if he turned around, he would see it. And this time, he wouldn't wake up. He jolted upright, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. The room was dark, save for the dying embers in the fireplace. His hands trembled as he wiped his face. Then, a whisper, right behind him. "John." The candle on his bedside table went out. His breath hitched. He dared not move, dared not breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against him like an unseen force. Slowly, painfully, something shifted in the shadows. He felt the bed creak. Something was on it with him, right behind him. He clenched his jaw. "Don't turn around." A low, distorted voice slithered through the room. "Don't turn around, John." His body shook with effort. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but he knew it wanted him to move. The whispers hissed in his ears. "It's getting closer." He squeezed his eyes shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, silence. The weight lifted. The air cleared. He was alone again, or so he thought. John stopped going outside at night, but the village was falling apart. More people vanished. The elders stopped speaking of leaving. It was as if they already knew there was nowhere to run. The whispers followed them all, not just John. The forest grew darker, the houses colder. The feeling of being watched was no longer an eerie thought. It was a constant, suffocating truth. And then the first body appeared, torn apart, twisted in ways no human body should ever bend. Eyes missing, mouth stretched into a silent scream. It was Elias, the boy. Only now, he wasn't a boy anymore. Something had changed him. Something had made him one of them. John stood in the center of the village, staring at the mangled corpse, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers laughed. "You should have looked back, John." And for the first time since that night, John felt his resolve break. Maybe he should have. Maybe he would. Because now he wasn't sure if he had escaped that night. Maybe he had never left the forest at all. Maybe the village had already been claimed. Maybe John was already one of them. And as he lifted his eyes to the surrounding trees, he saw them. Dozens of shifting, twisted things lurking just beyond the village's edge. Watching, waiting, smiling. And then the candlelight behind him flickered out. Darkness swallowed the village whole, and the whispers began again. And so the story never ends, because the whispering shadows never stop. The village was dead, not in the way that meant it was empty. No, people still lived here, still walked its streets, still whispered behind closed doors, but the life had drained from it. The air felt heavy, dense with something unseen, something foul. The trees pressed in closer than before, their gnarled branches reaching toward the rooftops like skeletal fingers. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, curling at the edges as if they had minds of their own. John no longer counted the days. Time had lost meaning. Every night the whispers returned, growing louder, more insistent. Every night the unseen thing came closer, and now something new had begun. The markings, they appeared overnight, scratched into doors, carved into wooden beams, smeared onto windows in something dark and foul-smelling, jagged, looping symbols that no one could understand, yet everyone feared. They pulsed with something sickly, as if they breathed, as if they watched. The elders tried to scrub them away, but they always came back by the next morning, deeper, more numerous. John woke one night to find them inside his house, etched into the floorboards beneath his bed. And that was the night he heard the knocking. At first, it was gentle, a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. John lay frozen in bed, breath caught in his throat. He turned his head slightly, eyes locked on the door across the room. The candle beside it flickered violently, as if caught in an unseen wind. The knocking came again. Tap, 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 slow, measured. As if whatever stood on the other side wasn't in a hurry. As if it knew he was awake, John swallowed hard, forcing himself upright. His mind screamed at him not to move, but something deeper, something ancient and instinctual, forced his feet to the floor. He stepped forward. The candlelight dimmed further. The shadows beneath the door writhed. John hesitated, every nerve in his body screaming in protest. But then, a voice. John. His blood turned to ice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, sharp, right on the other side of the door. "John, let me in." The voice was wrong. It sounded almost human, but something about it twisted at the edges, as if something else was speaking through it, as if the thing at the door was still learning how to use words. John clenched his jaw, gripping the wooden chair beside him for support. "Don't answer. Don't move. Don't even breathe." A long silence. Then, a slow scraping sound, something dragging its fingers or claws down the wood. And then, in a voice that almost sounded like his own, "You should have looked back, John." The candle went out, and the door creaked open. By morning, John was still alive, barely. He didn't remember how the night ended, only that he had woken up on the floor, drenched in cold sweat, his door still locked. But the whispers, they were louder now. The village was unraveling. People vanished every night. Sometimes they came back. Only they weren't the same. They walked too stiffly, blinked too slowly, spoke in voices that sounded borrowed. And worst of all, they watched John. Their eyes followed him wherever he went, unblinking, hollow. The forest edge crept closer. The trees no longer stood still. The symbols spread, and beneath them, new words had begun to appear. He is coming. He is here. Then came the fog. It rolled in from the forest one night, thick and black as ink, swallowing the village whole. It was unlike any mist John had ever seen. It clung to the ground, slithered between houses, moved with purpose. And in it, things moved, shifting, writhing figures that had too many limbs and not enough faces. John barricaded his door, pressing his ear to the wood as the sounds began. Wet, shuffling footsteps, a distorted, broken laughter, nails scratching against the walls, the windows, the roof. The fog pressed against the glass, twisting into shapes, things that shouldn't exist. And then, a whisper. Come outside, John. He shut his eyes, clutched his axe, didn't move. But the voice came again, closer. You have to see. His pulse thundered in his ears. And then, a third voice joined, a child's voice. Help me, John. His stomach lurched. Elias, the boy who had vanished. The boy they had found twisted and wrong. But Elias was dead, wasn't he? The door shook violently. John pressed himself against the wall, heart hammering. A pause. Silence. Then, a slow, deep exhale. The thing outside breathed. And this time, John could feel it against his skin. The candle by his bedside flickered, and in its weak, dying glow, John saw a shadow stretching across the floor. Long, twisted, inhuman. It was inside the house, and this time, he had to look. John knows he cannot escape. The whispers have woven into his bones. The village is no longer a place. It is a trap, a hunting ground, a cage made of shadows. The forest is closer. The things inside it are stronger. More people are missing, but they will return. They always return. And when they do, they will call his name, and one day, maybe soon, maybe years from now, John will answer, because the thing in the dark is patient. The thing in the dark never stops watching, and when John finally looks back, the story will end, but not before it begins again for someone else, for you. The whispers never stop. They never, ever stop. John had resisted for so long, too long. The village was gone, swallowed by the fog, erased from existence. The houses had rotted overnight, their wood blackened and crumbling, their windows shattered as if something had crawled through them. The people were either dead or something much worse, and John was the only one left, or at least, the only one who could still feel. He sat in the centre of the ruined square, axe resting in his lap, staring at the empty village that had once been his home. The air was silent. The trees had stopped moving. The whispers, for the first time, had stopped. It was waiting. He could feel it now, just behind him. It had been waiting since the night he took that cursed shortcut. The night he should have looked back, but now he had no choice. Slowly, painfully, John lifted his head. The sky had turned black, not from nightfall, but from something vast and hungry that had unfurled above him, its tendrils slithering through the air, forming impossible shapes that made his vision swim. And then, a single voice, not a whisper, not a hiss, but a voice that spoke inside his skull, deep and suffocating, wrapping around his thoughts like strangling roots. John. His hands trembled. He knew what was coming. Look. A sharp inhale. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. It's time. His breath hitched. His fingers curled into fists. Look at me. John clenched his eyes shut, shaking violently. Number. No. The ground beneath him cracked open. The air turned thick, wet, suffocating. The smell of rot filled his lungs. And then, hands. Hundreds clawing out of the earth. Pale. Writhing. Desperate. They grasped at him, pulling, tearing at his skin, at his mind. And John finally understood. He had never been alone. They had all been waiting for him, the villagers, the ones who disappeared, the ones who changed. They had all looked, and now it was his turn. His body was dragged backward, down into the pit, into the writhing abyss of limbs and mouths and shifting faces. And in his final moments, as the thing in the dark whispered its final, awful truth, he opened his eyes, and he saw everything that had ever been, everything that would ever be, everything that was waiting beyond the veil. His mind shattered instantly, his body twisted, stretched, became something else. And then John was gone, but the village remained. The ruins would stand for centuries. The fog would linger. The whispers would continue, because it always needed more voices, more souls, more people to make the same mistake, more people to look. And so, someday, someone will come, a traveller, a wanderer, a soul too curious for their own good. And when they do, the whispers will return, the thing in the dark will call their name. And this time, maybe it will be you. Tap, tap, tap. It's already at your door.